The smell of stale coffee and hot grease hung in the air of the roadside diner, a familiar perfume for the men of the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club. It was a place of quiet refuge, a neutral ground where the weight of their leather vests and the reputation that preceded them seemed a little less heavy. They sat in a corner booth, a collection of mountains in denim and leather, their conversation a low rumble that barely disturbed the clatter of cutlery and the morning news murmuring from a television mounted above the counter. Victor, the club's president, nursed a black coffee, his weathered face a roadmap of hard miles and harder decisions. Across from him, Bear, the sergeant-at-arms, built like an industrial refrigerator, methodically worked his way through a stack of pancakes that would have defeated a lesser man. Doc, their medic, a man whose calm hands had stitched up more than his fair share of wounds in field tents and clubhouse backrooms, stirred sugar into his tea, and Ghost, the quiet one, the club's unofficial investigator, stared out the window, his eyes missing nothing, his mind always cataloging, assessing, preparing. They were not looking for trouble. On a quiet Tuesday morning, trouble was the furthest thing from their minds. They were simply four brothers of the road, sharing a meal before the day's responsibilities called them back to the clubhouse. The other patrons gave them a wide berth, their glances a mixture of fear and curiosity. It was a reaction they were used to, a social buffer they had long since stopped noticing. The chime of the bell over the diner door was sharp, frantic. It wasn't the lazy ring of a customer entering for breakfast. It was a sound of alarm. Every head in the diner turned, including the four in the corner booth. A little girl stood framed in the doorway, a tiny silhouette against the bright morning sun. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her feet were bare, smudged with dirt and asphalt grit. Her simple pink dress was torn at the shoulder, and her face was streaked with tears and grime. She stood there for a heartbeat, her chest heaving with panicked sobs, her wide, terrified eyes scanning the room. The diner fell silent. The waitress froze mid-pour, coffee sloshing onto the counter. A man in a business suit lowered his newspaper, his mouth slightly agape. They were statues caught in a tableau of shock and indecision. But the men in the corner booth were not statues. They were coils of potential energy, and the sight of the child was the trigger that released them. Bear's fork clattered onto his plate. Doc was already halfway out of the booth. Ghost's gaze sharpened, locking onto the girl, with an intensity that saw past the tears to the source of the terror. Victor moved first. He didn't stand, didn't make any sudden movements that might frighten her more. He simply slid out of the booth and knelt on one knee, bringing his formidable presence down to her level. He was a large man, his shoulders broad, and his arms covered in intricate tattoos that told the story of his life, but his movements were gentle, deliberate. He held his hands out, palms up, a gesture of peace. The girl's eyes, blue as a summer sky, but clouded with a storm of fear, darted around the room before finally landing on him. She saw the gray in his beard, the deep lines around his eyes, and something else, a stillness, a solidity that promised safety. She took a hesitant step, then another, a small barefoot pilgrimage across the checkered linoleum floor. She stopped just out of his reach, her breath catching in her throat. Her voice, when it came, was a broken whisper, a sound that cut through the silence of the diner like a shard of glass. "Please," she trembled, her small hands twisting the hem of her torn dress. "Please, can you help? He's hurting my mommy." The words hung in the air, an accusation and a plea. The other patrons looked at each other, then away, their discomfort a palpable thing. Who was he? What should they do? Call the police? Stay out of it? Their hesitation was a heavy blanket smothering the room. But for the Iron Sentinels, there was no hesitation. There was only the child's plea. Victor's voice was a low gravel, softer than anyone in the diner would have imagined possible. "We can help. he said simply. "Where is your mommy?" The little girl pointed a trembling finger toward the door. "Outside, in the parking lot. He's trying to make her get in the car." That was all they needed to hear. Victor rose to his full height, his gaze sweeping over his brothers. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. A silent understanding passed between them, a language forged in years of riding together, of facing down threats side by side. Bear was already on his feet, his massive frame a promise of immovable force. Doc grabbed a handful of napkins, his medic instincts kicking in. Ghost had his phone in his hand, his thumb already flying across the screen. Victor placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his voice steady. "Lily," she whispered. "My name is Lily." Victor gave her a small, reassuring nod. "Okay, Lily, you stay right here with this lady," he said, gesturing to the stunned waitress, who was slowly coming back to life. "We're just going to go talk to the man." He turned and walked toward the door, his brothers falling into formation behind him. They moved without haste, their steps measured and heavy. Not heavy with anger, but with purpose. They were a wall of leather and steel, moving to intercept a storm. The diner patrons watched them go, their breakfast forgotten, holding their collective breath. The quiet Tuesday morning was over. The sun in the parking lot was bright and unforgiving, glinting off the chrome of a dozen cars. The scene Lily had described was playing out near a sleek, expensive-looking black sedan parked at the far end of the lot. A woman, her face pale and etched with fear, was struggling against the grip of a man in a crisp polo shirt and khaki pants. He looked like he belonged on a golf course or in a boardroom, not in a dusty diner parking lot, wrestling with a terrified woman. He had her by the wrist, twisting it cruelly as he tried to force her toward the open passenger door. "Get in the car, Sarah," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous threat. "Don't make a scene." The woman, Sarah, shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Richard. Please just let us go. I'm not going with you." Her plea was desperate, weak against his brute strength. He was a man accustomed to getting his own way, his face a mask of smug entitlement, now tightening into a sneer of frustration. He didn't see the four figures approaching, their shadows stretching long and dark across the asphalt. He was too focused on his victim, too wrapped up in his own power. Victor's voice cut through the tense air, calm and clear, yet carrying the weight of absolute authority. "That's enough." The words were not shouted, they were spoken, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. Richard froze, his head snapping up. He saw them then, four large men in motorcycle vests, standing a few yards away, watching him. His first reaction was annoyance, then disdain. He saw their patched leather, their long hair, their tattoos, and he made a critical, arrogant miscalculation. He saw them as beneath him. He let go of Sarah's wrist, shoving her slightly so she stumbled back a step. He straightened his polo shirt, adjusting his collar as if to reassert his social superiority. "This is a private family matter," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I suggest you and your friends get back on your little toys and ride away before you get involved in something that doesn't concern you." He tried for a dismissive smile, but it didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. Victor took a slow step forward, his brothers fanning out slightly behind him, a silent, intimidating formation. "The little girl inside said her mommy was being hurt," Victor stated, his gaze locked on Richard. "That makes it our concern." Richard scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "She's a child. She's hysterical. Her mother and I had a disagreement, that's all. Now, if you'll excuse us." He made to grab Sarah's arm again, but Bear took a single, ground-shaking step forward, placing his bulk between Richard and the woman. Richard's hand stopped in midair. It was then that Ghost spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an edge of cold precision. He hadn't taken his eyes off his phone. Richard Peterson, age 42, investment banker from the city. You have a restraining order against you, filed by Sarah Miller in the next state over. Looks like you're also in violation of your parole from a prior assault charge. Ghost looked up from his phone, his eyes like chips of ice. A domestic violence charge. The air crackled with a new tension. Richard's facade of respectability shattered like cheap glass. The color drained from his face, replaced by a blotchy, furious red. His condescending smile vanished and his lips peeled back into a snarl. The predator, unmasked, was showing his teeth. You have no idea who you're messing with. He spat, his voice losing its smooth veneer, becoming raw and ugly. I have lawyers who will bury you and this whole pathetic little club. Maybe, Victor said, his tone unchanging. But your lawyers aren't here right now. We are. The quiet certainty in his voice was more threatening than any shout. Richard, stripped of his power and his secrets, made his final mistake. He was a cornered animal, and he lashed out. With a roar of frustration, he shoved Sarah hard toward the bikers, hoping to use her as a distraction. In the same motion, he turned to run for his car, perhaps to escape, perhaps to retrieve a weapon. He never made it. He took 2 steps before Bear's arm shot out. It wasn't a punch or a tackle. It was a simple, brutally efficient interception. Bear's hand, as large as a dinner plate, clamped down on Richard's shoulder. All of Richard's forward momentum came to a dead, jarring halt. He was spun around, and before he could even register what was happening, his arms were pinned behind his back in an unbreakable grip. Bear lifted him slightly so his expensive loafers dangled an inch above the ground, neutralizing him completely. There was no struggle. There was no fight. There was only the clean, decisive application of overwhelming force. Richard gasped, the air forced from his lungs, his arrogant threats turning into a choked wheeze of pain and shock. He was done. The world can change in a single moment. For Sarah and Lily, that moment was the sight of their tormentor, so powerful and terrifying just seconds before, now utterly helpless, in the grip of a quiet giant. The standoff was over. The immediate threat was gone, but the aftermath, the trembling and the tears, had just begun. While Bear held Richard immobile, Doc was already moving toward Sarah. He approached her slowly, the way one might approach a frightened animal. He kept his hands visible, his voice low and soothing. Ma'am, are you all right? My name is Doc. Can I take a look at your wrist? Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning relief. She nodded numbly, extending her arm. A dark, ugly bruise was already forming where Richard had gripped her. Doc examined it with gentle, practiced fingers. It's not broken, he said softly, but it's going to be sore. We should get some ice on that. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers, and he offered a small, kind smile. You're safe now. He's not going to hurt you again. For the first time, a flicker of hope broke through the terror in Sarah's eyes. Inside the diner, the waitress had brought Lily a glass of water and was trying to comfort her, but the little girl's attention was fixed on the scene. Outside the window, when she saw Bear neutralize Richard, her crying stopped. She watched as Victor walked back toward the diner door, his expression calm and unreadable. He pushed the door open and knelt down in front of her again. It's okay, Lily, he said, his gravelly voice a balm on her frayed nerves. The bad man can't hurt your mommy anymore. We promised. Lily looked from Victor's face to the parking lot and then back again. She launched herself forward and wrapped her tiny arms around his thick neck, burying her face in the worn leather of his vest. Victor froze for a second, unused to such displays. Then his large hand came up and rested gently on her back, a silent promise of protection. The distant wail of a siren grew steadily louder. Ghost had made the call the moment they stepped outside. The town's sheriff, a man named Brody, was someone the Iron Sentinels knew well. Their relationship was one of wary respect. Brody didn't approve of their lifestyle, but he couldn't deny that they kept a certain kind of order and more often than not were on the right side of justice, even if their methods were unconventional. The squad car pulled into the lot, and Sheriff Brody stepped out, his hand resting on his service weapon as he took in the scene. The weeping woman, the subdued man in khakis, and the 4 imposing bikers standing like sentinels around them. Brody's eyes met Victor's. "Victor," he said, his tone neutral, "mind telling me what's going on here?" Victor gestured toward Richard. This man was assaulting the woman. Her daughter came into the diner asking for help. Bear gave Richard a slight shake. "His name is Richard Peterson. Ghost ran his name. He's got a warrant and he's violating a restraining order." Brody raised an eyebrow, impressed despite himself. He walked over to Sarah, his demeanor softening. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened?" Shielded by the protective presence of the bikers, Sarah found a strength she didn't know she possessed. Her voice was shaky, but it was clear. She told Brody everything about the abuse, the restraining order, how Richard had tracked her down, and how he had tried to force her and Lily into his car. As she spoke, her story solidified from a jumble of fear into a coherent, damning account. She was no longer just a victim, she was a witness. Empowered by the safety she now felt, she looked Sheriff Brody in the eye. "I want to press charges," she said, her voice firm. "I want to press all of them." Brody nodded, a grim look on his face. He turned to Richard, who was now sputtering threats about lawsuits and police brutality. "Mr. Peterson, you're under arrest." As his deputy cuffed Richard and led him to the patrol car, Richard twisted his head, his face contorted with rage, his eyes locking onto Sarah. "This isn't over," he screamed, his voice raw with impotent fury. "You think these freaks can protect you forever? I'll find you. You'll regret this." His threat hung in the air, a poisonous promise aimed at re-establishing the fear he had thrived on. But before the fear could take root in Sarah's heart again, Victor stepped forward, moving to stand directly in the path of Richard's hateful glare. He walked calmly to the open door of the squad car and leaned down, his face just inches from Richard's. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "No, you won't," Victor said, his voice a quiet, chillingly certain statement of fact. "You will not look for her. You will not call her. You will not think about her. Because if you do, you'll have to get through us first, and we'll be waiting." The promise in his eyes was absolute. Richard's face went pale. The bluster and rage drained out of him, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He had threatened a woman protected by the Iron Sentinels. Bad choice. Very bad choice. The aftermath of a storm is often quieter, but more complex than the storm itself. With Richard in custody, the immediate danger was gone, but the wreckage of his terror remained. Sarah and Lily had nothing but the clothes on their backs and a car that Richard had undoubtedly tracked. They were refugees in their own lives, with no safe harbor in sight. Victor led them back to the club's table in the diner, where the waitress, whose name was Marge, brought them fresh glasses of water and a plate of toast. Marge looked at the bikers with new eyes, her earlier fear replaced by a deep, burgeoning respect. Later that day, at the Iron Sentinels clubhouse, the chapter gathered around the heavy oak table in the center of their meeting room. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the low rumble of concerned voices. This was not a formal church meeting. It was a council of war, a planning session for a rescue mission. "The restraining order wasn't enough," Ghost reported, scrolling through information on a laptop. "He's rich. He has resources. He'll make bail and his lawyers will find a way to get him out with a slap on the wrist. The system might fail her." A younger member, a prospect named Ricky, shifted nervously. "Prez, we can't be their personal bodyguards forever. We have our own lives, our own problems." An older member, a grizzled road captain named Silas, shot him a hard look. "The club is our life, kid, and this is a club problem now." Victor silenced them both with a raised hand. "Silas is right. When that little girl walked into that diner, she wasn't just asking for help from four guys having breakfast. She was asking for help from the Iron Sentinels. We answered that call. We don't leave a job half-finished." His gaze swept around the table, meeting the eyes of every man there. "We find them a place to live, a safe place. We find Sarah a job. We make sure Lily can get to school without looking over her shoulder. We use our resources, our network, our strength, and we build a fortress around them that scum like Richard Peterson can't ever breach. This is what we do. This is who we are." A chorus of low affirmative grunts and solemn nods filled the room. The decision was made. The club was mobilized. They would provide a permanent solution. The story of what happened in the diner parking lot spread through the small town of Harmony Creek like wildfire. At first, it was just whispers, exaggerated tales of a biker gang brawl. But then Marge, the waitress, started telling people what she really saw. She described the terrified little girl, the frozen bystanders, and the immediate, decisive action of the bikers. She told everyone about the gentleness Victor showed Lily, and the quiet authority with which they handled a dangerous man. The town's perception, long colored by stereotypes and fear, began to shift. Marge placed an empty pickle jar on the diner counter with a handwritten sign that read, "For Sarah and Lily." She put the first $20 in herself. By the end of the day, it was overflowing with crumpled bills and loose change. The owner of the local garage, a man who had often complained about the noise from their bikes, called Victor and offered the small, clean apartment above his workshop, rent-free for the first 6 months. The woman who ran the town's only bookstore offered Sarah a job, saying she could use the help and that Lily was welcome to spend her afternoons there, surrounded by stories. The community, once wary of the bikers, now rallied behind their cause, inspired by their example. The Iron Sentinels orchestrated it all with quiet efficiency. Bear and a few other members spent a weekend changing the locks on the apartment, installing a simple but effective security system, and moving in donated furniture. Ghost did a deep dive into Richard Peterson's finances and legal troubles, compiling a file that he discreetly passed on to Sheriff Brody, a file that would ensure Richard's legal battles would be long, costly, and difficult. They didn't just offer charity, they offered security, a network of support that was both visible and invisible. They gave Sarah a prepaid cell phone with their numbers programmed into it. They made sure she knew that help was always just one call away. They became her unseen guardians, their presence a silent deterrent to any thoughts Richard might have of returning. A few days later, Sarah and Lily were settling into their new apartment. It was small, but it was clean, and most importantly, it was safe. It was theirs. Victor and Bear had stopped by to drop off a final box of kitchen supplies donated by Marge from the diner. As they were about to leave, Sarah stopped them. She stood in the doorway of her new home, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression one of profound, tearful gratitude. "I don't understand," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't even know us. Why? Why are you doing all of this for us?" Victor looked at Bear, then back at Sarah. He hesitated for a moment, the question touching a place deep inside him that he rarely exposed. "Come on," he said, softly. "Let me show you something." He led her back to his bike, and they rode the short distance to the clubhouse, a place she would have been terrified to even approach a week ago. Inside, the place was quiet. He led her to the main meeting room and sat down with her at the big oak table. The air smelled of leather, oil, and old wood. "You asked why," he began, his voice a low rumble. "When I was a kid about Lily's age, my old man, he was a lot like Richard, but we didn't have anyone to run to. My mother and I, we lived in fear every single day. The doors were locked, but the monster was already inside." He stared at the scarred surface of the table, seeing ghosts from a lifetime ago. "One night he got bad, real bad. My mother knew if we stayed, he might kill one of us. So we left. We ran with nothing but the clothes we were wearing. We slept in a car for a week before a stranger, a truck driver, bought us a bus ticket to a town where we had distant relatives." He looked up, and for the first time, Sarah saw the profound sadness that lay beneath his tough exterior. "I spent my whole childhood feeling helpless. I swore that if I ever got strong, I would never let anyone feel that helpless again. I would be the person we needed back then, the person who never showed up." He gestured around the room at the empty chairs. "Every man in this club, every single one of them has a story like that. Doc's father was a drunk who used his fists to talk. Ghost grew up in a dozen foster homes, some of them not so good. Bear's mother worked 3 jobs to keep them fed, and they were still one step away from living on the street. We all know what it's like to be small, to be scared, to have no one in your corner." He leaned forward, his expression earnest, his words stripped of all pretense. "This vest, this club, it's not about being tough. It's about being strong enough to protect the people who aren't. Our code is simple. We protect our own, and we protect those who can't protect themselves, especially women and children. It's the one rule we never, ever break. When we saw Lily, we didn't just see a scared little girl. We saw ourselves. We saw our mothers, our sisters, and we did what we wished someone had done for us." Tears streamed silently down Sarah's face, but they were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of understanding, of a gratitude so deep it had no words. She finally understood that these men, whom the world saw as outlaws and deviants, were in fact a brotherhood forged in the fires of shared trauma, their lives dedicated to ensuring that the fires that had scarred them would not be allowed to burn anyone else. A week later, there was a timid knock on the big metal door of the clubhouse. When Bear opened it, he found Lily standing on the doorstep, clutching a piece of folded construction paper. She was holding her mother's hand, but her eyes were fixed on the giant in front of her. I have something for Victor," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Bear smiled, a rare sight that softened his rugged features and led them inside. Victor was at the main table, going over some paperwork. He looked up as they approached, and his face broke into a genuine smile. "Hey there, Lilybug." Lily walked up to him, her courage returning. She held out the drawing. "I made this for you," she said. Victor took it carefully, as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. He unfolded it. On the paper was a crayon drawing, rendered with the charming imprecision of a 7-year-old. It depicted a group of very large men with black vests and big smiles, standing on motorcycles that had angel wings. In front of them was a little yellow house, and in the doorway stood a stick figure woman and a little girl, both holding hands and smiling. In the corner, in wobbly letters, she had written, "My Heroes." Victor stared at the drawing, his throat suddenly tight. He looked at the earnest, hopeful face of the little girl standing before him. Lily looked down at her shoes for a moment, then back up at him, her blue eyes shining with an innocent, profound sincerity. "I wish," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I wish I had a dad like you." The words struck the big, hardened biker with more force than any punch he had ever taken. They bypassed the leather, the muscle, the scars, and went straight to his heart. The room fell silent. Bear turned his head away, clearing his throat loudly. Doc, who had been cleaning a set of tools, suddenly found something fascinating in the corner of the room. A wave of raw, unvarnished emotion washed over the clubhouse, leaving every battle-hardened biker in the room struggling to compose himself. Victor felt a stinging in his eyes, an unfamiliar sensation he fought to control. He cleared his throat and knelt down in front of Lily once more. "You know what, Lilybug?" he said, his voice thick. "I think you're just about the bravest little girl I've ever met." He wrapped her in a gentle hug, holding the drawing carefully over her shoulder. In that moment, he was not just a club president. He was a protector, a guardian, a hero in the eyes of a child. And it was the most important title he had ever held. 1 year passed. The seasons in Harmony Creek turned, painting the landscape in the vibrant colors of autumn, the quiet white of winter and the hopeful green of spring. Life for Sarah and Lily had transformed in ways they could have never imagined. Sarah was now the full-time manager of the Bound Pages bookstore. The confidence she had found in the aftermath of her rescue had blossomed. She was no longer a woman defined by her fear, but by her resilience and her warm, welcoming smile. She was a fixture in the community, a friend to her customers, a testament to the power of a fresh start. Lily was thriving. She was a bright, happy second grader, her laughter a frequent and welcome sound in the aisles of her mother's bookstore. The shadow of Richard Peterson had faded from her life, replaced by the comforting, ever-present knowledge that she was safe. Her nightmares were gone. In their place were dreams of stories and adventures, and the occasional, comforting rumble of a motorcycle engine passing by on the main street, a sound that for her would forever be synonymous with safety. The Iron Sentinels had kept their promise. They were a quiet, constant presence in the background of Sarah and Lily's new life. A member might stop by the bookstore just to say hello and buy a paperback. Bear might be seen at the garage across the street, his presence a silent reminder that the town's new residents were under his protection. They never intruded, but they were always there, a silent, leather-clad guardian angel network. Their reputation in Harmony Creek had undergone a sea change. They were no longer the scary outlaws from the edge of town. They were the men who had saved the bookshop lady and her daughter. They were heroes. Inside the clubhouse, the heart of the Iron Sentinels, a new tradition had taken hold. In the most prominent spot on the wall of the main meeting room, a spot once reserved for club charters and old photographs, there now hung a simple, black frame. Inside it, carefully preserved behind glass, was a child's crayon drawing of bikers with angel wings. Lily's drawing. It had become a sacred object, a tangible reminder of their core mission. It was the first thing prospects were shown when they were taught the club's code. It was the last thing members saw when they left the clubhouse to ride out into the world. It was their North Star. Victor often found himself standing in front of it after a long day, the drawing a source of quiet strength. He would remember the feel of Lily's small arms around his neck, the sound of her voice saying those life-altering words. In a life filled with hard roads and difficult choices, it was a moment of perfect, unassailable clarity. They had done the right thing. They had made a difference. True strength wasn't measured in the roar of an engine or the power of a fist. It was measured in the safety of a child, in the peace of a mother, in the healing of a broken spirit. The hardest men often carry the heaviest burdens from their past, but sometimes those burdens forge them into the strongest shields for others. The men of the Iron Sentinels wore leather and rode machines of thunder, but their true armor was their compassion, and their real mission was to answer the calls for help that the rest of the world was too afraid or too indifferent to hear.